The dog was still breathing. That was the first thing Lena noticed, the shallow, uneven rise and fall of the animal's ribs beneath matted golden fur. The way his sides trembled with each labored breath, like he was fighting for something he was no longer sure was worth fighting for. He was tied to the dumpster behind the Volkov Industries building with what appeared to be a designer silk scarf, cream-colored, monogrammed, expensive enough to feed Lena's family for a month, knotted so tightly around his muzzle that the skin beneath had begun to chafe raw. His paws were scraped, his water bowl tipped over and bone dry. His eyes, when they finally found hers, were the color of amber and filled with something so human it stopped her cold in the middle of the alley. She forgot about the trash bags in her hands. She forgot about the fact that she was already 40 minutes into overtime, that her supervisor had told her one more late punt shout would cost her the job, that the February wind had turned the alley into something close to a wind tunnel, and her coat was too thin, and her gloves had a hole in the left thumb. She forgot all of it. She was already on her knees in the dirty snow before she had made any conscious decision to move. "Hey," she whispered, and her voice came out softer than she intended, the way voices do when they instinctively recognize something fragile. "Hey, I've got you." The dog flinched when her hand came close, then stilled. Then, with what seemed like an enormous act of trust from an animal who had every reason not to trust anyone, he pressed his nose into her palm. The silk scarf took her nearly 4 minutes to untie. Her fingers were shaking. From the cold, she told herself, only from the cold, and whoever had tied it had done so with a kind of methodical cruelty that spoke of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and had done it anyway. When the knot finally gave, the dog exhaled a sound that was barely a whimper, more like a release, like something that had been held too long finally being allowed to let go. Lena sat back on her heels in the snow and looked at him. He was a Caucasian shepherd, massive even in his current diminished state, broad, shouldered and thick, coated, the kind of dog that under different circumstances would have been imposing. The kind of dog that cost more than she made in a year. She knew, because she had seen him before, once. Briefly, being walked through the marble lobby of Volkov Industries on a leather leash by a man who walked like the building, had been constructed specifically to frame him. Dmitry Volkov's dog. The realization landed slowly, the way dangerous things often do, not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last. She looked at the monogrammed scarf still dangling from her fingers. The initials in the corner were not D, V. They were A.M. Elena Marchetti, the fiancée. Lena looked at the dog looked at Lena. In the yellow light bleeding from the building's service entrance, with the wind picking up and the temperature dropping, and the city going about its business with no awareness whatsoever that something had just shifted, she made a decision that she already knew would change things. She just didn't know how much yet. She wrapped the dog in her coat. His name, she learned later, was Tsar, which felt, in retrospect, like a warning she had not been equipped to read. Lena Vasquez was 26 years old and had been working as a night shift facilities associate at Volkov Industries for 14 months. Which was a clean, HR-approved way of saying she cleaned offices, hauled trash, restocked supply closets, and moved through the gleaming 50-story building like a ghost, present but unseen, necessary but invisible, one of the 60-odd people who made sure that when the important people arrived each morning, everything looked effortless. She had grown up understanding invisibility. It was not something she resented. It was simply the shape of the life she had been given, and she had learned to move inside it efficiently, keeping her head down and her expectations calibrated carefully to what the world had demonstrated it was willing to offer her. She sent money home every month to her mother in Queens. She kept a small notebook in her locker where she wrote down things she wanted to remember, not dreams, exactly. More like coordinates, places she was quietly navigating toward. She was not naive, but she was not defeated either. That distinction mattered. Dmitry Volkov, by contrast, occupied a different category of existence entirely. He was 34, the head of one of the largest private investment and logistics firms in the country, and he had inherited the business from his father at 20. 2. Under circumstances that it generated significant media coverage and almost no public transparency. The kind of wealth he commanded did not announce itself loudly. It did not need to. It was present in the quality of silence that surrounded him, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the particular stillness of people who understood instinctively that they were in the presence of someone for whom the usual social contracts simply did not apply. He was not handsome in any warm or approachable way. He was striking. Precisely and uncomfortably striking, all sharp angles and controlled stillness, with dark eyes that moved over a room the way a security camera does, cataloging and assessing without particular feeling. He wore charcoal and black almost exclusively. He did not make small talk. He did not attend the company holiday party. He had never, in 14 months, acknowledged Lena's existence in any way, which was fine, expected even. What she had not expected was for his dog to change that. She took Czar home in a borrowed maintenance cart, covered in her coat, his enormous head resting on her thigh with a heaviness that felt less like exhaustion and more like the specific weight of gratitude. She lived 12 blocks from the building in a third-floor walk-up with a landlord who had a strict no-pets policy. She set Czar up on a folded blanket in her bathroom, which was the only room where she could contain him if he panicked, and she sat on the bathroom tile beside him for 2 hours, feeding him water from a cupped palm because she had no bowl large enough, talking to him in the low, steady voice she used when she needed to convince something frightened that safety was real. By midnight, he was asleep with his chin on her knee. By morning, she had figured out that 3 of his paw pads were cracked, that he had not eaten in what looked like at least 2 days, and that whoever had done this to him had known exactly what they were doing. She had not yet figured out what to do about any of it. The decision was made for her at 8:47 the following morning. She had just arrived at work early, for once, because she had needed to settle Czar with food and water, and the specific negotiation of her neighbor, Mrs. Park, agreeing to check on him in exchange for a month of Lena carrying her groceries, when she rounded the corner of the 42nd floor supply corridor and walked directly into a conversation she was not supposed to hear, or more precisely, she heard the end of it. Handle it discreetly. No reports, no records. I want it gone. The voice was low and controlled and female, and it belonged to Elena Marchetti, who was standing in the corridor in a cream silk blouse that matched. Lena now noticed with a cold dropping sensation in her stomach the same fabric as the scarf she had unknotted from Czar's muzzle the night before. The person Elena was speaking to, one of the building's security supervisors, a heavy-set man named Roland, who had been with the company for years and who had a family and a mortgage and apparently a price. Nodded once, his eyes flat. And if someone asks, no one will ask. Elena said, no one cares about a dog. She turned then, and for one suspended, terrible moment, her gaze swept the corridor. Lena had pressed herself into the supply alcove with a stillness born of 14 months of practice. She did not breathe. She did not move. She watched through the narrow gap as Elena Marchetti, with her perfect posture and her expensive blouse and her monogrammed scarves, walked away down the hall as though she had just resolved a minor scheduling conflict. Roland stood for a moment longer, then he pulled out his phone and made a call. Lena stood in the alcove with her back against the wall and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. And she thought about Czar asleep on her bathroom tile, and she thought about the way his amber eyes had looked when he first saw her, that particular quality of dim, surrendered hope. And she thought about the notebook in her locker with its carefully written coordinates. Then she straightened up, pulled out her phone, and took a photograph of the monogrammed scarf still tucked in the bottom of her bag. She did not go to HR. She had considered it briefly, in the way you consider an exit that you already know is locked. HR at Volkov Industries was a function, not a refuge. It existed to protect the company, which meant it existed to protect the people at the top of the company, which meant that a night shift facilities associate walking in with a photograph of a silk scarf and a story about a muzzled dog would be processed, documented, and quietly neutralized before lunch. She had watched it happen to others, a woman on the cleaning crew who had reported a supervisor for harassment, a maintenance worker who had raised a safety concern about the freight elevator, both gone within 3 weeks. Both departures framed as voluntary. Lena was not naive, so she went back to work. She moved through the building as she always did, efficiently, quietly, without drawing attention, and she watched. She had always been good at watching. It was one of the skills that invisibility teaches you, if you are paying attention, that people reveal themselves constantly when they believe no one important is looking. She had learned more about the true architecture of Volkov Industries from 14 months of emptying wastebaskets and restocking printer paper than most mid-level managers learned in years of meetings. What she observed over the following 2 days was this. Alina Marchetti moved through the building like she already owned it. She held that particular ease of a person whose position has never been seriously threatened, who has operated so long inside a structure of protection that the possibility of exposure has become genuinely theoretical. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, precisely, with no accidents. She laughed at the right moments. She touched Dmitry Volkov's arm in the lobby on Tuesday morning with a proprietary lightness that suggested ownership. Dmitry did not react to the touch. That was the thing Lena noticed. He did not lean into it. He did not acknowledge it. He simply continued his conversation with the 2 men flanking him, his posture unchanged, his expression unchanged, the way a building does not react to a flag flying from its roof. Alina's hand rested on his sleeve for 4 seconds before she withdrew it, and something moved briefly across her face, too fast and too controlled for most people to catch before her smile settled back into place like a mask that had slipped 1 centimeter and been immediately corrected. Lena filed that away without knowing exactly why. On Wednesday evening, she came back from her break to find her locker standing open. The notebook was gone. Not the money in the side pocket, not the spare phone charger, not the photograph of her mother tucked beneath the shelf liner. Just the notebook, the one with the coordinates, the small, careful record of the life she was slowly navigating toward. Gone in a way that was designed to be understood as a message rather than a theft. She stood in front of the open locker for a long moment with her hand on the cold metal door, and she felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite anger but lived in space between the two where the most clarifying emotions reside. She closed the locker, she went back to work, and that night she made a decision that she understood, even as she was making it, was the kind that cannot be unmade. The 48th floor was not part of her assigned area. The cleaning contract for the executive suites was handled by a separate, smaller crew with security clearance and NDA and uniforms that were a slightly different shade of gray from hers, a distinction she had always found quietly absurd. The idea that the prestige of a floor could be conveyed through the particular gray of a uniform. But she knew the schedule. She knew that on Wednesday nights the executive crew finished by 9, and she knew that Dmitry Volkov worked late. She had seen the light under his office door from the stairwell window on more evenings than she could count, a thin gold line that persisted long after every other light on the floor had gone dark. She used the service stairs. The 48th floor was different from the floors below it, in the particular way that power expresses itself through architecture, not louder, but quieter. Less, the carpet absorbed sound. The walls were a shade of cream that whispered rather than spoke. The air held a different quality, cooler and still, as though the ventilation system had been calibrated to the preferences of a single person. She had one reason to be here, and it was not a safe one. She found his office at the end of the corridor, behind a set of double doors that were, as she had half expected given the hour, not fully closed. She could hear very faintly the sound of a single ice cube settling in a glass. She knocked. The silence that followed was of a specific quality, not the silence of someone who had not heard, the silence of someone who was choosing how to respond. Enter. His voice was exactly what she would have predicted if she had tried to predict it, which she had not allowed herself to do. Low, measured, and containing within it a frequency that bypassed the conscious mind and went directly to the older, more animal part of the brain that deals in threat assessments. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was large and almost aggressively uncluttered. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city laid out below them in cold winter light. A desk that held only a laptop, a glass, and a single folder. No photographs, no plants, nothing personal except for one thing, a large cedar-lined dog bed in the corner near the window, empty, its fleece blanket still holding the impression of a heavy body. Dmitry Volkov looked up from whatever he had been reading. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, with that flat, cataloging attention that held no warmth and required none. His gaze moved over her uniform, her face, the bag on her shoulder, and back to her face, and in the time it took her to take 3 steps into the room, she understood that he had already assembled a preliminary file on her in his mind, the kind of man who processed people like data. "You're not from the executive crew," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said, "I'm not." Another silence. He set down the glass. "Then you have approximately 30 seconds. He said, "to tell me why you're in my office before I call security." Lena reached into her bag. She placed the monogrammed scarf on his desk. She watched his face. In 14 months of invisibility, she had developed a particular skill for reading the small movements of people who believed their faces were controlled. The almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. The single breath drawn slightly slower than the ones before it. The way the jaw sets differently when something lands that the person was not prepared to catch. All 3 happened in the space of 2 seconds. Then his face went still again. "Sit down," he said. She did not sit down. She stood on the other side of his desk with her hands loose at her sides and met his gaze and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. It was a technique she had not been taught so much as grown into, the understanding that silence, wielded with stillness, has a kind of power that words often undermine. He studied her for a long moment. "Where did you find it?" he said, not a question either, a sentence with the shape of a question and the weight of a command. "Tied around your dog's muzzle," she said, "behind the building, Monday night." Something moved in his eyes. Fast and dark, like something crossing deep water. Tsar. The name came out flat, a statement. But she heard it, the single additional syllable of silence that lived after it, the one that spoke more than the word itself. "He's alive," she said. She paused, aware that what she was about to say was either going to help her or end this conversation in the worst possible way. "He's with me. I took him home. I didn't know what else to do." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Dmitry Volkov rose from his chair. He was taller than she had registered from a distance, and the office, which had seemed large when she entered, recalibrated itself around him in a way she did not entirely have a name for. He moved around the desk, not toward her, but to the window, and stood with his back to her, looking out at the city. His hands were in his pockets. His shoulders were very still. "You cleaned up the alley," he said quietly. "Yes, you photographed the scarf before you used it to wrap him." She had not told him that. She felt a cold, precise recognition, the sensation of realizing that the man you are speaking to is significantly more observant than you had accounted for. "Yes," she said. He turned from the window. In the low light of the office, with the city spread behind him like something he personally owned, he looked at her with an expression she could not name. Not cold exactly, not warm, something more complicated than either. "You understand," he said quietly, "what you've walked into." "I think so," she said. "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost something human. "You don't, not yet." He picked up his phone. He dialed a single number. "Clear my 9 o'clock tomorrow," he said to whoever answered. Then he looked at Lena over the phone with those flat, cataloging eyes and added, "And run a background check on Alina Vasquez, night shift, facilities." He ended the call. Returned his gaze to her. "Go home," he said. "Take care of my dog. Come back tomorrow at 9. Use the main entrance." She held his gaze for one moment longer than was comfortable, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement. Then she picked up her bag, left the scarf on his desk, and walked out. The elevator doors closed behind her. She stood alone in the small gilded box as it descended, and she pressed her back against the wall, and she let herself take one long, unsteady breath. Just one. Then she straightened up, and by the time the lobby doors opened, she was composed again, moving through the marble entrance with the same efficient invisibility as always, her face giving nothing away. Behind her, on the 48th floor, the light under Dmitry Volkov's office door stayed on until 3 in the morning. She arrived at 9 o'clock exactly, not 8:50, 9, not 9, no 1. 9 o'clock because she had stood on the pavement outside the main entrance for 4 minutes with the cold working its way through her better coat, the one she reserved for occasions that required her to be taken seriously, and she had watched the revolving door and she had thought, with the particular clarity that comes from having very little margin for error, that the only thing she could control in whatever this was herself. The lobby receptionist looked at her with the specific expression of someone recalibrating. Lena gave her name. There was a phone call, brief and murmured. Then an elevator card was produced, and she was directed, without further explanation, to use the private lift on the east side of the lobby, the one that Lena had, in 14 months, never seen used by anyone except Dmitry Volkov himself. She rode it to the 48th floor alone. The doors opened directly into an anteroom she had not seen the night before, a small, perfectly appointed space with a single desk, currently occupied by a young man with close, cropped hair and the watchful, economic stillness of someone trained to be an extension of another person's, rather than a person in their own right. He looked up when she stepped out of the elevator with the same flat assessment his employer had used the night before, and she thought, not for the first time, that certain men assembled their staff the way others assembled mirrors, choosing reflections rather than people. "Mr. Volkov will be with you shortly," he said. "Please wait." She waited. She did not sit. She stood near the window and looked out at the city in its morning configuration, purposeful, bright, indifferent, and she thought about Tsar, who had eaten a full bowl of food that morning and pressed his enormous head against her hip while she drank her coffee, and who had watched her leave with amber eyes that held a question she did not know how to answer yet. She heard the door before it opened, not a sound exactly, more like a shift in the quality of air in the room, a pressurization, subtle but unmistakable, the particular atmospheric change that some people create simply by being about to enter a space. Dmitry Volkov opened the door and looked at her. He was in charcoal again. Of course he was. His tie was the color of graphite, and his eyes were doing the thing they did, that flat cataloging sweep, except that this morning there was something different beneath it, something she might have described as sleeplessness if she had been willing to assume he was capable of it. "Come in," he said. The office looked different in daylight. Still spare, still controlled, still shaped entirely by the absence of anything unnecessary, but the morning light came through the floor, to ceiling windows at a low winter angle that caught the edges of things and turned them gold, and she noticed again the empty dog bed in the corner, and the way his gaze moved to it for one fractional second before returning to her. He sat behind the desk. She sat across from it this time. He had not asked her to. She simply did, and he noted it. She saw him note it. And something that was not quite a reaction, but was adjacent to one moved briefly through his expression and was gone. He opened the folder on his desk. "Lena Vasquez," he said, in the tone of a man reading from a document he has already memorized. 26, Queens, 14 months with the company. Prior employment, hospital administration, 2 years. Prior to that, a year at a nonprofit. Single, no criminal record. One written warning in your personnel file for clocking out late. He paused. 4 times in the last month. "I walk home," she said. "I like the cold." He looked up from the folder. The silence between them had a different texture this time. Not the armed silence of the night before, when they were both still assessing the terrain. Something slightly more complicated. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched just past comfortable. "Why didn't you report it?" he said. "To who?" He considered this. "You took the photograph before you used the scarf," he said. You kept it. You came to me directly rather than going to building management or the press. He closed the folder. That suggests either unusual loyalty to this company or unusual intelligence about how it operates. I want to know which. Does it matter? Everything matters, he said flatly. Answer the question. She looked at him across the clean, dark surface of the desk, and she chose her words the way she chose everything carefully, with attention to what she was not saying as much as what she was. I've worked here for 14 months, she said. I know how the building works. I know what happens to people who go through official channels with unofficial problems. She paused. I also know that whoever did this wanted it to stay quiet, which means the one thing that could actually help your dog was the one thing that wasn't going to happen if I followed protocol. He was very still. You did it for the dog, he said. I did it because it was the right thing to do, she said. The dog happened to be the reason I knew it. Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, he said, How is he? The question landed differently from everything else he had said. It was the same voice, the same register, the same controlled flatness, but underneath it something had shifted. The way a single note changes the key of a chord, and she felt it the way you feel a drop in temperature before you can name it. He's okay, she said, more gently than she had intended. He was dehydrated, and his paw pads were cracked. He hadn't eaten in a while, but she paused. He's resilient. He trusted me faster than I expected. Something moved through Dmitry Volkov's face. Not much, barely anything. A tightening at the corners of his eyes that lasted less than a second and was gone so completely that she might have doubted it if she had not been paying the kind of attention she was paying. He trusts easily, he said. It's a flaw. She thought that was an interesting word for it. She thought several other things too, and said none of them. Then the door opened without a knock. Elena Marchetti walked in carrying 2 coffee cups and wearing a smile that was, Lena observed, a degree or 2 warmer than her usual setting, the kind of warmth that is deployed rather than felt. She stopped when she saw Lena. The smile did not disappear. It recalibrated. In real time, with a speed and smoothness that was almost impressive. It shifted from the warmth it had been carrying for Dmitry into something cooler, more assessing the particular expression of a woman who has just encountered a variable she was not expecting and is rapidly calculating its significance. Dmitry, she said, her voice was even, perfect. I didn't realize you had a meeting. You didn't knock, he said. Not an accusation, an observation, but the distinction in his voice was razor thin, a beat of silence. I brought coffee, Elena said, setting both cups on the corner of the desk with a deliberateness that was almost a territorial act. Her eyes moved to Lena again, a quick sweep, top to bottom, and Lena watched her take in the coat, the face, the stillness, and arrive at a conclusion. You're one of the cleaning staff, Elena said. It was not a question either, like employer, like fiancé. Facilities, Lena said, of course. The smile settled into something more comfortable now that the variable had been categorized. Dmitry, whatever this is, can it wait? We have the Marchetti lunch, it can't wait, he said. Elena looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the scarf, which still lay on the corner of his desk where Lena had placed it the night before, its monogrammed initials facing up. A.M. in the morning light, with Elena standing 4 feet away in a cream silk blouse that matched it almost precisely. The sight of it was loaded. The kind of loaded that a room feels when everyone in it knows something, and no one has said it yet. Elena's gaze found the scarf. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Lena counted. When she looked up, her expression had not changed. That, more than anything, was what made Lena's skin go cold. Not guilt, not fear, not even surprise. Just a micro-adjustment, the same recalibration, the mask repositioning itself over something that was not remorse. I'll wait outside, Elena said pleasantly. She left. The door closed with a soft, precise click. Dmitry Volkov looked at the closed door for a long time. Lena looked at him. She watched the line of his jaw. She watched his hands, which were flat on the desk, very still, in the way hands are still when they are being consciously held that way. She watched the single long breath he drew through his nose, slow and controlled, and the way his eyes went briefly somewhere that was not the room. She said nothing. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was not a moment for words. This was a moment for exactly what it was, a man sitting with something he had just been forced to see and could not unsee, and the particular quality of that process, which requires silence, the way a wound requires air. When he finally looked back at her, his face was composed, but she had seen it. That one unguarded moment, that single fractional crack in the architecture, it was so brief she almost wondered if she had imagined it. But she had not imagined it. And somehow, in a way she was not ready to examine, that small human crack in all that controlled stone was the most unsettling thing she had encountered since walking into this office. More unsettling than the power, more unsettling than the danger, more unsettling than any of it, because it meant he was not what he appeared to be. And neither, she was beginning to realize, was any of this. "I need you to keep Czar for a few more days," he said. His voice was completely level. "I'll have supplies sent to your apartment. You'll be compensated for your time." "I don't want compensation," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said quietly, "what you're going to do about it. I just want you to be careful." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. "You're in facilities," he said finally. "Yes, you should go back to that," he said. "And stay there. Keep your head down. Don't speak to Alina. Don't look at her. Don't give her any reason to notice you." He paused. "She already has." Lena stood. She picked up her bag. She was at the door when his voice came again, quiet and oddly precise. "What did he do?" he said. "When you untied the scarf." She turned. "He pressed his nose into my hand," she said. Something in his face shifted, just slightly, almost nothing, barely a breath of movement, and then it was gone, locked back behind everything he had built to contain it, and he was looking at his desk again. His expression returned to its default state of controlled remove. She left. The elevator carried her down through the floors of the building, and she stood with her back against the wall and looked at her own reflection in the polished doors, and she thought about the way his voice had changed when he asked about the dog. She thought about the empty dog bed in the corner of the office. She thought about the word he had used, flaw, and she thought that sometimes the things a person calls a flaw in someone else are the things they have punished themselves for feeling. The supplies arrived at her apartment at 6 o'clock that evening. Not a bag of dog food and a water bowl. Not a polite envelope of cash. A van. A white, unmarked van that pulled up outside her building with a precision that suggested it had been given the address by someone who did not do imprecise things, and from which two men unloaded. With the brisk efficiency of people accustomed to executing instructions without commentary, a cedar dog bed, a set of stainless steel feeding bowls, a 30-pound bag of what turned out to be refrigerated fresh, prepared dog food, a veterinary first aid kit, and a large fleece blanket that smelled very faintly of cedar and something else she could not name but which made Czar, when she pressed it to his nose, lift his enormous head from her lap and go very still in the specific way animals go still when they encounter a scent that means something. She watched him process it. His amber eyes went somewhere private for a moment, somewhere she could not follow, and then he exhaled a long, slow breath through his nose and pressed his face into the blanket and stayed there. She sat on the floor beside him with her back against the couch and said nothing. Mrs. Park knocked at 8 to check on him and ended up sitting on the bathroom floor for 40 minutes, feeding him small pieces of cheese and telling him about her late husband, who had also, she said, been very large and very gentle and very misunderstood. Lena made tea and listened from the doorway and thought that there was something quietly devastating about the way love persists in people after the thing it was meant for is gone, how it just keeps looking for somewhere to put itself. She went to bed at 11. She lay in the dark and listened to Czar breathe from the new cedar bed in the corner of her room, and she thought about Dmitry Volkov's face when she had told him about the scarf. She thought about the scarf, She thought about Elena Marchetti looking at it for exactly 3 seconds and feeling nothing that showed. She thought about the notebook that had been taken from her locker. And she thought, with the slow, cold clarity of someone assembling a picture they had been hoping would turn out to be something else, that the notebook had not been taken as a warning. It had been taken as an inventory. Someone wanted to know who she was, what she cared about, what she stood to lose. She was asleep by midnight, but it was not a restful sleep. The next 3 days passed in a state of careful normalcy that Lena understood from long practice was the most dangerous kind. She went to work. She moved through her floors. She restocked and cleaned and hauled and clocked out on time, every time, with the punctuality of someone who knows they are being watched and has decided that the best response to surveillance is impeccable behavior. She did not seek out Alina. She did not avoid her either, because avoidance, in the architecture of a building where everyone's movements were logged by access card and camera, is itself a kind of signal. She saw Dmitri twice, once in the lobby on Thursday morning, passing through with 2 men in dark suits, his eyes moving over the space with their usual systematic assessment. They passed across her and moved on, and she felt the precise moment of it. The non-acognition, deliberate and calibrated, the specific quality of a gaze that sees and chooses not to show it. And she understood that this was him being careful on her behalf, which meant he was worried, which meant whatever he was managing was more complicated than she had been told. The second time was Friday evening, near the service corridor on the 32nd floor. She came around the corner with a supply cart and found him standing alone in the hallway with his phone to his ear. And for the 3 seconds before he heard the cart's wheels, he was different. The posture was the same. The suit was the same. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, something in the way his free hand was pressed flat against the wall beside him, that spoke of a man holding himself together through physical contact with a solid surface, and the image of it landed on her with a weight she was not prepared for. He heard the cart. He turned. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. He lowered the phone slightly. She stopped the cart. The corridor held them both in its fluorescent quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have and shorter than she would later, privately, acknowledge she had wanted it to. Then he turned back to the wall, and she pushed the cart forward and moved on, but she carried that image with her for the rest of the shift. His hand flat against the wall, the particular quality of a person using the solidity of something external to manage something internal that has gotten briefly too large to contain. She had done the same thing herself once. Standing in a hospital corridor 2 years ago, her palm pressed against painted cinder block, the fluorescent lights exactly like these, and the doctor's words still rearranging the interior of her world into a configuration she did not recognize. She understood that posture. She understood it in her body, not just her mind. And that understanding frightened her in a way that the power and the danger and the surveillance had not, because it meant that something was happening that had nothing to do with a dog or a scarf or any of the practical elements of the situation she was in, something quieter, something she could not afford. On Saturday morning, Roland knocked on her apartment door. She had not given Roland her address. She noted this the way you note the specific sound a lock makes when something that should not be able to open it does. He was alone, which was either reassuring or the opposite, and he was wearing civilian clothes, which meant this was not official. He looked uncomfortable in the way that men look uncomfortable when they have been sent to do something they know is wrong, but have calculated is survivable. She opened the door but did not step back to let him in. "I'm going to need the dog," he said. "No," she said. He shifted his weight. Behind her, she heard Czar rise from the cedar bed. Not a bark, not a growl, just the soft, deliberate sound of a very large animal repositioning itself closer to the door. M.S. Vasquez. Roland's voice had the rehearsed quality of a speech that had been prepared for a version of this conversation that was not going the way it was supposed to. "I don't think you understand the position you're in." "I understand it fine," she said. "The dog belongs to..." "The dog?" she said quietly, was tied to a dumpster with a muzzle on him and left in the cold without food or water. Whoever he belongs to on paper can make that argument to someone with the authority to heal it. That person isn't me. Roland looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, Czar made no sound. But she felt his presence at her back like a warm, solid wall, and she thought that there was something almost symmetrical about it. She had been his protection 4 days ago, and now in his enormous steady silence he was being hers. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Roland said. "I know," she said, and she closed the door. She stood in her hallway with her back against the wood and her heart doing something loud and complicated in her chest. And Czar pressed his head against her hip, and she put her hand on his broad skull and felt him breathing, steady and slow, and she focused on that. Then she picked up her phone and sent a text to a number she had been given 3 days ago with the instruction to use it only if necessary. "Someone came to my apartment for the dog. I need to know how much time I have. The response came in 4 minutes. Stay home today. Don't open the door for anyone else. I'll handle it." She stared at the message for a moment. She thought about what it meant, the speed of it, the certainty of it, the particular quality of "I'll handle it" from a man who said nothing he did not mean. She put the phone down. She fed Czar his breakfast. She sat at her kitchen table with her tea and her thoughts and the thin winter light coming through the window. And she let herself, just for a moment, in the privacy of her own kitchen with no one watching, feel the specific fear of someone who has walked into something much larger than they anticipated and cannot yet see all of its edges. Just for a moment, then she put it away. He came himself. She had not expected that. She had expected a lawyer, or the watchful assistant, or another van with efficient men. She had not expected to open her door at 2 in the afternoon to Dmitry Volkov standing in her hallway in a dark coat, with his collar turned up against the cold. He had presumably walked through from wherever his car had stopped, looking at her apartment door with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and is recalibrating the distance between where he thought he was going and where he actually is. She opened the door wider. He stepped inside. He was quiet for a moment, taking in the apartment with that systematic gaze. The small rooms, the mismatched furniture, the stack of library books on the coffee table, the photograph of her mother on the shelf, the tea cooling on the kitchen table. She watched him take it in, and she did not perform anything about it. Did not apologize for it or explain it, or make any of the small preemptive gestures that people make when they are aware of being seen in the context of their own smallness by someone who occupies a much larger context. It was her home. It was enough. Then Czar came around the corner from the bedroom. He stopped when he saw Dmitry. The moment that followed was, she would struggle later to find the right word for it. Not emotional, exactly, in any performed sense. Something quieter and more absolute than that. Czar crossed the room in 4 slow steps and pressed his entire enormous body against Dmitry's legs. And Dmitry Volkov, who did not smile, who did not explain himself, who had built an architecture of controlled remove so complete that most people who worked with him daily had probably never seen him look anything other than contained, went down on one knee on her living room floor and put both arms around the dog and pressed his face into the thick fur at Czar's neck. He did not make a sound. Neither did she. She stood in the doorway to her kitchen, and she watched this man who had been nothing but controlled surfaces and calculated silences since the moment she had met him, hold his dog on the floor of her small living room with a completeness and a lack of self-consciousness that felt like witnessing something that was never meant to be witnessed. She did not move, she did not speak, she barely breathed. After a long moment he rose, he straightened his coat. He turned to face her, and his expression was composed almost composed, but his eyes were doing something she had not seen them do before. Something raw and briefly unmanaged, and he held her gaze for 2 full seconds before he got it under control. She looked back at him. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish it. And in the silence between them, in her small living room with the winter light coming through the thin curtains and the tea cooling on the table, and Czar leaning his full weight against the leg of the man who had clearly, in whatever cold and complicated life he lived, been the thing this dog was always waiting to come back to, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a quiet cellular shift, the kind that happens below the level of decision, below the level of any rational accounting, the kind that cannot be undone. He sat at her kitchen table. She made more tea, not because she thought he drank tea, but because her hands needed something to do, and the ritual of it steadied her, and she set a cup in front of him and sat across from him and waited. He looked at the cup. He did not drink from it. Her family, he said without preamble, controls 3 logistics contracts that are currently essential to operations in 6 Eastern territories. The merger that consolidates those contracts is contingent on engagement. He paused. I have known this for some time. She said nothing. What I did not know. He continued, his voice still level, still controlled, but carrying beneath it something she was learning to hear. That subtle frequency of a man choosing to say something he has not said before. Was the extent to which she was willing to go to remove things she considered inconvenient. He was never inconvenient, Lena said quietly. He looked at her. No, he said, he wasn't. The silence settled between them, and this time it was not armed. It was not the silence of assessment or strategy, or 2 people calculating the terrain between them. It was simply 2 people sitting with the weight of something true. Czar lay between their chairs with his chin on his paws, his amber eyes moving between them with the ancient, patient attention of an animal that understands more than it can say. She had my notebook taken, Lena said, not an accusation, a fact offered carefully. His jaw tightened. I know, he said. Then she knows I have the photograph. Yes. And she knows you know. Yes. She wrapped her hands around her tea. The warmth of it was grounding. She needed grounding. So what happens now? She said. He looked at his own cup for a moment. Then he looked at her, and she saw it again, that fracture line, that hairline crack in all that controlled stone, and this time it was wider. And this time he did not move to close it immediately. And the fact that he was letting her see it, felt more significant than anything else that had happened. I don't know yet, he said, which from a man who always knew was the most honest thing he could have said. The call came on Monday morning at 7:43. Lena was standing in her kitchen in the gray pre-work quiet, her hair still damp, Czar eating his breakfast with the focused devotion of an animal that has remembered what it means to be cared for. When her phone lit up with a number she did not recognize, she answered it because she had learned in the past week that unknown numbers were no longer something she had the luxury of ignoring. It was a woman's voice, clipped, professional, carrying the specific neutrality of someone delivering information they have been instructed to deliver without editorial. Ms. Vasquez, you are being formally notified that your employment with Volkov Industries has been terminated effective immediately. A letter will be sent to your address on file detailing grounds. Building access has been revoked. Please do not attempt to enter the premises. The line went dead. She stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and the silence of it pressing against her ears, and she looked at Czar, who had finished his breakfast and was now watching her with amber eyes. That held, she thought, a sympathy that was almost unbearable in its simplicity. She set the phone down. She picked up her tea. She stood at the window and looked at the street below, where the city was assembling itself into another Monday, with complete indifference to the fact that the careful structure of her life had just been dismantled in a 30-second phone call. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not afraid. She was angry, quietly, completely, and with a precision that had nowhere to go yet. She was angry. She texted the number. They terminated me this morning. The response came in under 2 minutes, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had possibly been expecting this. I know, don't go in. I'm dealing with it. She looked at the message. She typed, I want to know what dealing with it means before it happens. A pause, longer than the others. Then, come to the office at 11. Use the east entrance. She looked at Czar. I'll be back by lunch, she told him. He thumped his tail once against the cedar bed, which she chose to interpret as confidence. She arrived at 11 to find the 48th floor in a state of controlled tension, so dense it was almost atmospheric. The watchful assistant met her at the elevator with an expression that had abandoned its professional neutrality in favor of something more human. A tightness around the eyes, a quality of suppressed urgency, the look of someone who has been in the middle of something significant all morning and has not had time to recalibrate. He led her not to the main office but to a smaller room off the anteroom, a conference space spare and dark, wooded with a long table and a view of the city and 3 people already seated at who were not Dmitri. 2 were lawyers. She could tell by the documents and the particular quality of stillness that people who spend their lives in rooms where things are decided develop over time. The 3rd was a woman she did not recognize, 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that has been through significant weather and emerged from it with a quality that was not hardness, but was close to it, experienced, watchful, carrying the specific gravity of someone who has seen a great many things go wrong and has become very good at the moment before they do. Nobody spoke when Lena entered. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. Dmitri came in 4 minutes later, and he was not alone. Elena Marchetti walked in beside him with her hand on his arm and her smile in its warmest setting, and she was talking about something social, something effortless, and then she saw Lena across the table, and the sentence she was in the middle of did not so much end as simply stop, the way music stops when someone pulls the needle from the record. The silence was immediate and total. Alina looked at Lena. Lena looked at Alina. Dmitri closed the door. "Sit down, Alina." His voice was the same as always, controlled, low, carrying that frequency that bypassed argument. But Lena heard it now, what was beneath it, the thing she had been learning to hear, not anger exactly. Something colder than anger, the particular temperature of a decision that has already been made. Alina sat. She did not look at the lawyers. She did not look at the documents. She looked at Lena with the expression of someone rapidly mapping a situation and finding it more complex than anticipated. And beneath the mapping, beneath the assessment, something else, something that was not quite fear, but was in the same family. "I don't understand why she's here," Alina said pleasantly. "You will," Dmitri said. He remained standing. He did not take the chair at the head of the table. He stood slightly apart from it, which Lena understood was deliberate. He was not framing this as a meeting. He was framing it as something else. One of the lawyers opened a folder. "MS Marchetti," he said, in the tone of a man who has had this particular kind of conversation before and has stripped it of everything except the essential. "We'd like to discuss the events of Monday the 3rd, specifically your movements in the building between 6 and 8 p.m. Alina turned the pleasant smile toward the lawyer. "I was in the building in the evening, yes. I often am. Were you in the service area on the ground floor at any point?" "I may have been. I don't always track my exact route." "Were you in possession of a cream silk scarf at that time, monogrammed with your initials?" "A beat?" "Barely a beat, but Lena was watching and she caught it." "I have several scarves," Alina said. "I couldn't say which one I was wearing on a specific evening. This one," the lawyer said, and placed a photograph on the table. It was not Lena's photograph of the scarf. It was a still from a security camera. Time-stamped, clear. Elena Marchetti in the service corridor at 7:14 p.m., the scarf visible at her neck in the direction of the rear exit. The temperature in the room dropped. Alina looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, the pleasant smile was still there, but it had lost something, some essential structural element, some internal support, and without it the smile looked like what it had always been, a performance, an extremely accomplished one, but a performance nonetheless. "This proves nothing," she said. "I walked through a corridor. There are 4 additional stills," the lawyer said, "taken at intervals, showing you at the rear exit, showing Tsar being led out, showing you returning without him." Silence, real silence this time, the kind that has weight. Lena watched Alina's face and saw something extraordinary happen. She saw the moment a person who has operated for a very long time inside a structure of protection realizes, with sudden and complete clarity, that the structure is gone. It was not dramatic. It was almost the opposite of dramatic. It was a stillness, A total, cellular stillness that passed across Alina Marchetti's features like a shadow crossing water. Then she turned to Dimitri, and the smile became something else entirely. Dimitri. Her voice was different now. Lower, stripped of the pleasantness. What was underneath was harder and more real, and in its way more honest than anything she had said in the entire meeting. You are genuinely going to do this over a dog? The room held its breath. Dimitri looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and the quality of that look was, Lena had no better word for it, final. Not cruel, not cold in the performed way, simply final, the way the closing of a door is final, without drama, without revision. No, he said quietly, I'm doing this over the fact that you looked at something that trusted you and decided it was disposable. Alina stared at him. She stopped, started again. That's about the dog. It's about what the dog tells me, he said. The silence that followed was absolute, and in it something broke, not loudly, not with any performance. Just broke, the way things break when the last small weight is added to something that has been under pressure for a very long time. Lena watched it happen on Alina's face and felt no satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about watching even a person who had done a terrible thing arrive at the moment they understand what it has cost them. It was just human, painful and human and devoid of triumph. Alina stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at Lena, and for the first time in all of their encounters, brief, loaded, conducted almost entirely through implication, her expression was not calculating. It was simply the face of a woman who has lost something and knows it. Congratulations, she said. It was not entirely clear what she meant. She left, the door closed. The lawyers gathered their documents with the brisk efficiency of people who have done their part and are ready to exit a situation that is about to become personal. The silver-haired woman rose, exchanged a look with Dimitri that carried the compressed communication of people who have known each other through significant events, and followed them out. And then it was just the two of them, Lena and Dimitri. In a quiet conference room on the 48th floor with the city laid out behind the windows in cold winter light, and the documents on the table and the photograph of the service corridor still lying face up between them, its timestamp reading 7:14 p.m. on the night that had started all of this. She looked at it. He looked at her. Your job, he said. I'll reinstate it today. Back pay for the days missed. If you want a different position, higher floor, better hours, it's available. I liked my floor, she said. Something moved in his eyes. Lena. Her name in his voice was different. It was the first time he had used it, and she had not anticipated what it would do. The way it landed in the room with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its two syllables, and she held very still and waited for whatever came after it. He looked at the table for a moment, then at the window, then back at her, and this time he did not perform the control. He just looked at her, directly and without management, and she saw what was there, what had been there building under all of it. The scarves and the dog bed and the hand on the wall and the kitchen table and the small apartment and all the silences between them, and it was not simple, and it was not easy, and it was clearly not something he had a practiced relationship with, and that was exactly what made it devastating. I don't, he stopped, started again. I'm not, another stop. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table, a small unconscious gesture, the physical equivalent of the wall in the corridor. And she watched him search for words. He was clearly not accustomed to needing, and felt something in her chest respond to that search in a way she could not prevent and did not try to. I know, she said softly. He looked at her. I know, she said again. You don't have to. The silence between them then was the most extraordinary of all the silences she had collected in the past week. It was not armed, and it was not weighted, and it was not the silence of two people managing each other. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something and both of them knowing it, and neither of them moving yet, because the moment before a thing becomes real is the last moment it can still be anything, and that particular kind of last moment is very hard to leave. His hand moved. It moved across the table, slowly, without pretense, and came to rest near hers, not touching, not quite, just near. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. Close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance of strangers. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. He was looking at her with an expression that was raw and unmanaged, and entirely without the architecture of control that had framed every previous version of him she had encountered. And in it she saw something she recognized. Not from him, from herself. From standing in a hospital corridor with her palm against cinder block, and the whole interior of her world rearranging itself into a shape she didn't recognize and didn't choose and couldn't go back from. The particular look of someone who has been alone with something heavy for so long that the possibility of setting it down has become almost incomprehensible. She turned her hand over, slowly, without drama, just turned it over, palm up on the table, an offering. Nothing more than that. Nothing that required anything of him that he wasn't ready to give. He looked at her open hand for a long moment. Then he placed his over it, and neither of them spoke. And the city went on outside the windows, indifferent and bright, and the photograph sat between them with its timestamp. And somewhere across town, in a small apartment, a large golden dog was sleeping on a cedar bed that smelled of the person who had come back for him, and the silence held them both, and it was, finally, for the first time, the good kind. 3 days passed before she saw him again. They were quiet days, in the way that days are quiet after something loud has moved through them. Not empty, but settled, carrying the particular stillness of air after a storm has passed, and everything is still adjusting to the new configuration of itself. She went back to work on Tuesday. She moved through her floors with the same efficiency as always, the same invisibility, except that something had changed in the quality of it. It was no longer something imposed on her. It was something she was choosing, and the distinction between those two things she was finding was everything. The building felt different, or perhaps she was the one who was different, and the building was simply reflecting it back. She did not see Dmitri on Tuesday, nor Wednesday. She heard, through the specific information network that exists in every large building among the people who are considered too unimportant to guard information from, that there had been meetings, legal ones, that the Marchetti contracts were being restructured, that certain arrangements were being renegotiated with a thoroughness that suggested they were not being renegotiated so much as dismantled. She filed this information away without examining it too closely, the way you avoid looking directly at something bright until your eyes have adjusted. Tsar remained at her apartment. This had not been formally discussed. No one had come to collect him, and she had not raised the subject, and every evening she came home to his warm weight and his amber eyes and the specific comfort of an animal that has decided you are its person and has made peace with the fact that the world is sometimes confusing, but this, at least, is not. She had started talking to him in the evenings, not in the low, careful voice she had used in the beginning, when he was frightened and she was managing him. Just talking, the way you talk when you have been alone long enough that the sound of your own voice in a quiet apartment has become something you are no longer willing to go without. She told him about her mother, about the nonprofit and the hospital and the notebook with the coordinates, about the specific quality of loneliness that is not dramatic and not acute but simply chronic, the low-grade variety that you stop noticing the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator, until one day the refrigerator is quiet and the silence is enormous. He listened with his chin on her knee and his amber eyes half closed. She thought he was probably the best listener she had ever had. On Thursday evening, she came home to find a single envelope on her doormat, not slipped under the door, placed on the mat with a precision that suggested it had been put there by someone who was deliberate about such things. Her name on the front in handwriting she did not recognize, controlled, angular, the handwriting of someone who has disciplined even the small automatic expressions of themselves into something ordered. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her coat still on, and the envelope in her hands, and Tsar pressing his nose against her hip. She opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, heavy stock, no letterhead, 4 sentences. The position in building operations is yours if you want it. Compensation details are attached on the second page. Czar should stay where he is for now. He seems to have made his choice. She read it twice. She turned to the second page, which was indeed a compensation summary, and which listed a salary that made her sit down on the floor of her hallway with her back against the front door and stare at the ceiling for a moment while Czar licked her ear with the calm certainty of an animal who has never doubted that things would work out. She read the 4 sentences again. He seems to have made his choice. She thought about that for a long time. She found him on the 48th floor on Friday morning in the corridor near the east window, the same corridor where she had seen him with his hand against the wall, except that this time he was simply standing, looking out at the city, his coffee cup held loosely, his posture carrying something she had not seen in it before. An ease, not much, not a dramatic transformation. Just the very early, very fragile version of ease, the kind that arrives in a person when something that has been tightly held for a very long time has been, for the first time in recent memory. Set down, she stopped beside him. He looked at her, and the look was direct and unmanaged and carried in it everything that had been in the conference room on Monday, everything that had been in her kitchen, everything that had accumulated in the silences between them over the course of a week, that had rearranged things irreversibly. "The position," she said. "I want it." "Good," he said. She looked out at the city. He looked out at the city. Beside them, the window held the winter light at its usual low angle, turning the edges of things gold, and the building went about its business around them with complete indifference to the fact that 2 people were standing in a corridor having a conversation that was, on the surface, about nothing more than an employment decision. "He ate the good food this morning," she said, "the refrigerated kind. He's developing opinions. Something happened at the corner of his mouth." It was not a smile, not fully, but it was the anteroom of one, the small involuntary movement of a face that has remembered, briefly, that it is capable of it. She saw it. She looked back at the window so he would not see that she had seen it, because she understood instinctively that some things need to be allowed to happen without being witnessed to directly. At least in the beginning, he's always had opinions, Dmitri said. He simply requires the right conditions to express them. She thought about that. "Most people are like that," she said quietly. A pause. "Yes," he said, "they are." The city stretched out below them, gray and gold and indifferent, and the silence settled between them like something that had finally found its proper place, and it was warm, and it was real, and it was the kind of silence that is not an absence of something but a presence, the presence of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other and have arrived without quite meaning to at the surprising and slightly terrifying territory of being simply, plainly, themselves. She felt him shift slightly. Not much, just a degree, the small unconscious movement of a person orienting toward warmth. She did not move away. She was almost at the elevator when he spoke again. "Lena," she turned. He was still at the window, his coffee cup in his hand, the city behind him. He was looking at her with an expression she was still learning to read. She suspected she would be learning to read it for a long time, that it was the kind of face that reveals itself in layers, slowly over seasons, and that the revealing itself was something to be moved through rather than arrived at. He looked like he was going to say something. He looked for one unguarded moment like a man standing at the edge of something and choosing, for the first time in a long time, to step forward rather than back. Then he simply said, "Thank you," 2 words, quiet, direct, carrying in them everything that could not yet be said, and everything that had already been said without words, and everything that was still, carefully, becoming. She held his gaze. "Take care of your dog," she said. The corner of his mouth moved again, and this time she saw it clearly. And this time she let herself. She stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed, and she stood in the small gilded box as it descended through the floors, and she pressed her back against the wall, and she let herself feel, fully without management, the terrifying and extraordinary sensation of something beginning, not arrived, not certain, not safe in any way that could be measured or guaranteed, just beginning. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and she stepped out into the marble and the light and the city beyond the glass doors. and she thought about Czar on his cedar bed and her mother in Queens and the notebook that had been taken, and the coordinates she had been quietly navigating toward for years. She thought about a man standing at a window with a coffee cup and an almost mile and 2 words that had carried everything. She thought about the specific, unmistakable feeling of a life rearranging itself into a shape you didn't plan for but recognize, the moment it arrives, as the one you were always moving toward. She walked out through the revolving doors. The February cold met her like a held breath finally released. And somewhere above her, on the 48th floor, the light in his office stayed on. This time, she knew, it was not loneliness keeping it burning.